So the writ of habeas corpus is the only thing out of English common law that we had enshrined in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2 of the Constitution says that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless, when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. So the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended. So that's a right that every single American, all 329 million Americans, has the right to habeas corpus, except for the cases of rebellion or invasion. The public safety may require it. So really, Lincoln didn't break the law in the cases of rebellion, right, in cases of invasion. So it says that a writ of habeas corpus is a judicially enforceable order issued by a court of law to a prison official, ordering that a prisoner must be brought to the court so it can be determined whether or not that prisoner had been lawfully imprisoned, and if not, whether he or she should be released from custody. Habeas court petition is from client or the lawyer. For a person in prison, the petition must show that the court ordering the detention or imprisonment made a legal or factual error. It's a constitutional right that a prisoner can present evidence before a court that he or she has been wrongly imprisoned. And so this is essentially the trial before the trial. When this order is released, it's saying, were you allowed to arrest this person in the first place? So everybody has a right to habeas corpus. Now, habeas corpus means something about the body, keeping the body, doing something with it. You have the body. So it's Latin. Habeas corpus is you have the body. The Latin phrase for gotcha, right? We got your body. So, you know, are we allowed to have it? So again, it's English common law tradition. It's enshrined in the Constitution. And a lot of people point to Abraham Lincoln for suspending it. In fact, Congress passed the Habeas Corpus Suspension Act in 1863 to retroactively cover up some of his crimes, but then it was used to go ahead and extend the breaking of habeas corpus for those people that were in rebellion. So I'll get to more to that in a second. I want to make a comment about something that Trevor Noah had said, and it ties in with all this. So Trevor Noah was sitting there saying we should just go ahead and give Donald his wall, because if Donald declares a national emergency, well then Donald will see how much power that a national emergency has. So Ronald Reagan, he declared national emergency when he fired all the air traffic controllers, right, because apparently unions don't matter. The Carter administration declared a national emergency with the Iranian hostage crisis. Barack Obama declared a national emergency over the swine flu. Okay, so Trevor Noah says we need to go ahead and give Donald Trump his wall, because if he finds out the power that he gets with a national emergency, well, there would be no stopping him. He'd be the dictator from hell that everybody had suspected him of being to begin with. So, what can he do during a national emergency? Well, Donald could freeze bank accounts. He could shut down communications facilities. He could deploy the military domestically. What is Trevor Noah doing? Is he giving Dernard a bunch of ideas? Hey, Dernard, here's a bunch of ideas. Freeze bank accounts, shut down communications facilities, deploy the military domestically, right? He just gave him a whole bunch of ideas. Now, Trevor Noah once said that he gets pushbacks. He gets some pushback whenever he mocks the Mexicans. So Trevor Noah doesn't mind mocking the French and the Germans, but when it comes to the Mexicans, he says that there's pushbacks. Well, maybe Trevor Noah doesn't understand the racist element in America. But now Trevor Noah supports a wall with Mexico. So Trevor Noah also starts a bunch of jokes out with, I actually feel for Dernard on this one. Dernard has a good point with this one. So Trevor is the executive of his own TV show, so you might see Dernard's executive power as his own. Trevor, you know, I don't know. Where would Nelson Mandela be if he just came to the apartheidist? So I think it's a stupid tactic. It seems like Trevor Noah doesn't really understand power that well. Concede to Donald on the Trump. Concede to Dernard on the wall now, and you'll be conceding to Dernard's temper tantrum for the rest of his life. So if you allow temper tantrum, you know, that temper tantrum baby to get his way, well, what's next after the wall and the immigration debate? Well, he's going to round up 11 million illegals on trains and deport them all. So Donald is, you know, very much, he's going to get everything that he's ever wanted. If the Democrats cave, all he has to do is just act like a baby, and then he'll get his way. Can he work on convincing Congress? So, I'm not for sure why Trevor Noah would suggest such a thing. He's a comedian, right? I like a lot of the stuff that Trevor Noah, says. He's entertaining. But a lot of these corporate guys, I feel like you need to go to a psychiatry office, because you're not a corporate machine. So I think you just need to, every day, day in, day out, you got to make fun of the guy. So he's got a show. Maybe Trevor Noah just feels bad that he had made fun of Dernard wanting to fuck his own daughter. So Trevor Noah had said, given him all these different ideas, and so what can Donald Trump really do? Those are the things in the national emergency, but I feel like his power, he's got national emergency powers, he's got war powers, he's got power of the purse. So if he just operates, just gets the color of law. So there's lots of the Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. The reason why this is a big deal is because when you're a war president, you're able to arrest the legislators of the states. So Baltimore, 1/3 of all the legislators of Baltimore were arrested. So Abraham Lincoln was arresting the government officials of Maryland. So here's the story of Abraham Lincoln and the Habeas Corpus Suspension Act of 1863. So it was signed into law by Abraham Lincoln, passed March 3rd, 1863, passed the House by 90 to 45, 2-1, passed the Senate 33 to 7, 4-1. So overwhelming margins, right? This is in the middle of the Civil War, in the heart of the Civil War. So this is when they passed the law in 1863, but all the trouble begins in April 1861. So one of the highest profiles cases was John Merriman. So Maryland legislator John Merriman was arrested for trying to stop the troops from going to Washington, D.C. into Baltimore. And then he was held at Fort McHenry by Union military officials. His attorney filed a writ of habeas corpus so that a federal court could examine the charges. But John Merriman would stay in jail for 7 weeks. April 19th, 1861, 20,000 Confederate sympathizers in Baltimore. So remember, you have a right to habeas corpus except for in times of invasion or rebellion. So a federal court, they wanted a writ of habeas corpus for John Merriman, but he's a Confederate sympathizer. So they're trying to get a train, they're transporting troops, and they're going into Maryland, which is a border state, right? So there's going to be some lovers and some haters. Well, while they're sitting in the train with troops into Baltimore, it causes a riot. So April 1861, Washington, D.C. is undefended. And there are a bunch of rioters in Baltimore, Maryland. And they were threatening to disrupt the reinforcement of the Capitol by rail. The U.S. Congress was also afraid to convene because of all this turmoil, all this riot, all this commotion. So April 27th, 8 days later, after they're stopping the train, Abraham Lincoln suspends habeas corpus between Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia, and then later up through New York City. When he suspended habeas corpus, the federal officials arrested a bunch of people. The Baltimore police commissioners were arrested by revolutionary military officials. Judge William Fell Giles of the U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland issued a writ of habeas corpus. The commander of Fort McHenry said for 2 weeks in Giles' district, where his court was under the control of the revolutionary military officials. So these are basically just some Confederate sympathizers inside the federal government that were trying to provide some protection for these Confederate rioters. So the U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney, writing in as a U.S. Circuit Court for judge for Maryland, ruled that Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the right to suspend habeas corpus, but not the President. So the President couldn't enforce it until Congress passed it. And like Andrew Jackson, Lincoln was like, okay, Roger Taney made his ruling, now let's see him enforce it. So they ignored the ruling of the Chief Justice. Now, the Chief Justice wrote it as a Circuit Court judge, so he didn't write it as Supreme Court. None of the other Supreme Court justices issued an opinion on this matter, so essentially it's just a couple of judges, right? You had the attorney file for the writ of habeas corpus, and then you had this Roger Taney say, all right, I'll go ahead and issue it. Here's a writ of habeas corpus. Now let's have these trials. So, September 1861, the arrest continued. Henry May, a sitting member of Congress from Maryland, and a third of Maryland's General Assembly was arrested. So, they arrested a bunch of people, right? Henry May, then that Merryman guy, and a third of Maryland's General Assembly. So, he's arresting state governments. The suspension of habeas corpus area had been expanded. Frank Key Howard wrote an editorial criticizing Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln threw him in jail too. He was arrested by the federal troops and imprisoned at Fort McHenry, which is ironic considering who he was related to, Francis Scott Key. February 14th, 1862, Abraham Lincoln ordered all political prisoners released and offered them amnesty so long as they wouldn't aid the Confederacy. So they had to say that they were against the Confederacy. So that's it, right? All right, you can get out, but do you hate the Confederacy? Yes. Okay. Congressman Henry May was released December 1861, introduced a bill requiring the federal government to either indict by grand jury or release all political prisoners under the Habeas Corpus Suspension Act. The Habeas Corpus Suspension Act was until 63, so it's passed in the House. Later portions are going to be used that required indictments to be issued by the grand jury for those suspected of treason or being traitors. So Congress Henry May issues this bill. He was one of the people that was arrested, so as soon as he gets out, he's writing this bill. It doesn't get passed, but a portion of his bill does eventually. July 1862, the Union begins to draft soldiers. When the drafts happened, people were pissed. There was riots and dissenters all over the place. August 6, 1862, one Missourian had said to Union General Henry Halleck that he wouldn't wipe his ass with the stars and stripes. So Union General Henry Halleck arrested him. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton issued sweeping orders August 8, 1862. So this is just 1 month after the Union draft begins. He issues a suspension of the writ of habeas corpus over the entire country. So this is the first time the suspension of habeas corpus was issued over the entire country, not just for Maryland and Philadelphia and New York City, but instead of just an emergency situation, this was the Civil War. So it was an emergency situation all the time. The entire year was an emergency situation. So this allowed a lot of police officers, sheriff's constables to decide arbitrarily who was loyal and disloyal. 350 people were arrested September 1862, the next month. 7 months later, that was after all this turmoil had begun. So August 1862, he suspended habeas corpus over the whole country, mainly so nobody would interfere with the draft, and also so nobody could discourage enlistments or aid the Confederacy. So 10 to 15,000 overall were arrested without a prompt trial. So that's crazy that people used to get trials for their arrest. So now you get arrested and you have to sit in jail for a day or two until a judge either bonds you out or releases you on your own recognizance. But there's no writ of habeas corpus trials. Senator Thomas Holliday Hicks said that the arrest and the arrest alone saved Maryland from everlasting destruction, and he approves of the arrest then and now and only wished there were more arrests. So that's Senator Thomas Holliday Hicks. He was saying that's exactly what we should have done. We saved Maryland. In fact, we probably should have arrested more. September 15, 1863, suspending habeas corpus throughout the Union for any case involving prisoners of war, spies, or traitors, or any member of the military. He imposed martial law on Kentucky July 5, 1864. There was a non-delegation doctrine. No branch could transfer power to another branch. So that was the argument that was used against it, saying that Congress wasn't allowed to give the presidency the power that they had been given in the Constitution. That argument was ignored. Andrew Johnson restored civilian courts to Kentucky October 1865 after a year and several months of martial law. The Copperhead Democrat Clement Vallandigham was arrested for anti-war speeches. So Democrat Clement Vallandigham, I want to say of Indiana, he was of the northern states. He gave anti-war speeches, which they said that gives aid to the enemy. So Ambrose E. Burnside arrested him for giving comfort to the enemy. Lincoln commuted the sentence in exchange for deportation into the South. So it was, all right, Clement, you want to get out, but you got to go to the South since you're basically a Confederate anyways. Well, they dropped Clement Vallandigham off in the South. They deported Clement Vallandigham, a Democrat, a Copperhead, because he was an anti-war Democrat, but a congressman, and he turned himself into the authorities, and he said he was a unionist, and he sat in a Confederate prison. The habeas corpus suspension was also used against Mary Elizabeth Jenkins Surratt. She was the lady that owned the bar that the assassins had talked about killing Lincoln in. July 7th, 1865, lawyers got a writ of habeas corpus, served it on General Winfield Scott Hancock, and both Hancock and Andrew Johnson. President Andrew Johnson went to court and says that Andrew Johnson suspended the writ of habeas corpus. So Mary Elizabeth Jenkins Surratt was killed and hung. So the writ of habeas corpus, they tried to save her, but it was suspended. So Andrew Johnson actually upheld some of the suspension of habeas corpus that Abraham Lincoln had enacted. Eventually, the suspension of Habeas Corpus Act provisions were omitted in the revised statutes of the United States several years later. There is also the Military Commissions Act of 2006. George W. Bush is going to suspend habeas corpus to persons determined by the United States to be an unlawful enemy combatant in the global war on terror. And so the writ of habeas corpus was suspended until after the military trial. So he suspended the writ of habeas corpus on October 17th, 2006 for this global war on terror. So there is some precedent for him to do that. So this whole thing, right, that was an interesting little case study. It was a war. It was during the Civil War. The reason why I mention this is because ICE, the chief of ICE, he had said that it's time to arrest liberal politicians in sanctuary cities. So that sounds very much like suspending habeas corpus. We're going to just go ahead and arrest a bunch of Maryland state legislators. We're just going to, arrest a bunch of these judges and these senators and these congressmen for the states. So Abraham Lincoln did it, but he did it in very drastic times, called for drastic measures. It was a civil fucking war. Gettysburg, you saw 10,000 people die every day. So it was in his best interest to quell the rebellion and the insurrection, the rioters, as quick as possible, so that way we could go back to the business of being Americans and to end slavery eventually. So I forgive Lincoln for all these things. Lincoln actually got Congress to pass the law, so he, may have done an emergency thing, and really only the president can declare a national emergency like that. When he declared a national emergency, he arrested a whole bunch of people to stop all those rioters in Baltimore, Maryland. So he suspended habeas corpus, yeah, but it was during wartime, and so the law, he didn't supersede the law. You're allowed to suspend habeas corpus during cases of rebellion or invasion. The public safety may require it. So only in those cases of invasion or rebellion can habeas corpus be suspended. And it was a case of rebellion. So he actually followed the law to the T. They pointed out that it was a power of Congress. Congress handed him the power with the 1863 suspension of Habeas Corpus Act, and then eventually it's written off the books several years after the war was over. So I don't fault for Lincoln for doing that. That was, the Civil War. So that's, brother versus brother. That was some intense times. Now, I mention that because that's something, that's a national emergency that could be declared. If you have air traffic controllers who are, striking and the union wants more money, well, you could fire them. If the Iranians get a couple Americans, then you can, national emergency. If there's a swine flu, declare a national emergency. If there's a civil war brewing, you could declare a national emergency and arrest a whole bunch of people. So it's not just deploying the military domestically, which is what Lincoln did, shut down communications facilities, freeze bank accounts. Those are conditions of war. So I think if he does something like that, he really has to make a good argument that this is a case for war. A national emergency isn't war, so I think he might be able to get away with a national emergency because it's not war. And he's threatened it, and he's a fascist, so he's itching to do it. He might just do it just to see what the hell happens. And I hate to say this, but the immigration problem in America is a crisis. It's not a crisis for most Americans. It's a crisis for those who have to deal with illegal immigration. So those on the border, those in the cities, and, there's been 4,000 people that have been killed. There's 11 million illegals, 25,000 people coming over the border every month. So there's a problem with a lot of illegals already being in here, and then there's a problem with a lot more illegals coming in. And you want to get mad about that term, illegals, they're humans, and they deserve human rights, and they deserve to exist. They are allowed to exist in this country. I want them to exist in this country. I want a immigration law to be passed so they can come out of the shadows and they can, get a pathway to citizenship. But the way that the law is now, if they were to say, hey, this is who we are, we've been here the whole time, well, we're going to deport them, and then we're going to put a strike against their name so they can't come back for 10, 20, 30 years. So there's no reason for them to tell us that they're here. They should just keep living in the shadows, keep on popping out American babies, and then if they get caught, then, I guess take their just desserts. But that's the law. The reason why they have to live like that is because the American people and the American Congress hasn't passed an immigration law since 1990. We haven't passed an immigration law this millennium. And so we should pass an immigration law every 10 years just to keep up with the times so we're all on the same page. We need to pass an immigration law to allow the bulk of the 11 million people to become citizens. We also need to allow children and refugees and asylum seekers. There's a lot of things that we need to do, but essentially we need an immigration law. We need to pass an immigration law because this is a crisis. Healthcare is a crisis. That's true. Poverty is a crisis. I heard 30 million Americans don't have health care. 15 million American children are in poverty. Those are crises. Climate change is a crisis. What was the other thing? The gun deaths and the opioid addictions. The opioid deaths are crises. So there are plenty other, this isn't the only crisis that we're faced with, but I would say that it's a crisis. It is a problem that needs to be addressed. It's been ignored. George W. Bush had an immigration law already. He had some pretty decent ideas, to be honest with you. He wanted to legalize most of the 11 million that are here, so not amnesty. So some get amnesty, some get deported, but for the most of the 11 million, they are good, honest, hardworking citizens. Let's give them a chance to, shine through and, do. So we need an immigration law, and the reason we don't have an immigration law is because Congress hasn't passed an immigration law, and the American people don't demand an immigration law. So we need an immigration law. We need to take care of this problem, this crisis. I don't think a wall is a deterrent. A wall. I don't care for Donald, so I think politically you should obstruct Donald, but you need to seal up the border, right? You need to get the 11 million people deported or amnesty or legalized, and then once you handle the 11 million people, you got to seal up the border. And the problems is more than just they're coming into this country and how dare they. We're, creating a lot of turmoil in Central America, so we need to help those countries that we've destroyed. So a Marshall Plan, I think taking USAID, taking the war on drugs off of USAID is vital. The war on drugs is a hypocritical policy for the rest of South America. We bought, Americans buy all that cocaine from Colombia, and they buy all that heroin and meth from the Central American states, and then they give the government a bunch of money to fight a war on drugs. So it's a hypocritical policy. If the Americans would quit buying so many goddamn drugs, and then quit sending all their government money to make sure other governments enforce a war on drugs. The war on drugs has failed. It's failed all over the place, and every single place where the war on drugs, the alternative, has been utilized, it's been a success. It's been a success in Colorado, in Washington. It's been a success in Portugal. It's been a success Paraguay or Uruguay. Everywhere that the alternative has been implemented, the alternatives have succeeded and the war on drugs has failed. So by forcing these countries to take USAID money only if they declare war on drugs is further pushing the problem. Why do you have all those cartels south of the border? The reason why we got the cartels is because of the war on drugs and America's insatiable demand for drugs. Between the two, that's a hypocritical policy. So there's a number of things that we need to do. Immigration we have an immigration crisis. I hate to admit it, but 4,000 people are getting killed by illegal people that, because of the Americans and the Congress, they haven't passed a law on it. They're living in the shadows. So I'm not blaming all 11 million. I'm saying, legalize most of the 11 million, but to get them legalized so we know their names, who they are, and, something about them instead of them being in the shadows and living scared to death for the rest of their lives. So that's a crisis. That's the crisis that needs to be solved. Sealing up the border is important, but the reason why they're running over the border is because they're poor as shit, so we can help build their countries up. And part of me thinks, you know, why would you want to go to another? Why not fight in your own country? But that's the thing. They only make $5 a day, so getting a minimum wage job here, they could really, you know, to take care of themselves and then send the extra back there, and then they can, you know, live better than they ever lived in their entire lives. So, yeah, that's national emergencies. That's Abraham Lincoln arrested 1/3 of Maryland's legislature in the very beginning of the Civil War. And it's not a civil war right now. There is red and blue divide, but I think that it's not left versus right, but up versus down. And I see more similarities between me and my countrymen, whether they're liberal or conservative, than me and my government, those rich-ass corrupt millionaires. So, yeah, if a national emergency is declared, everybody better brace yourself, because that does give him a lot of power. He can freeze bank accounts, deploy the military domestically, shut down communication facilities, and he can arrest state governments and state officials. So those liberals in sanctuary cities, he might be able to arrest them. They mentioned it. They floated the idea out there. So it's not, you know, it's not a civil war yet, but they're pushing right up against civil war conditions. And so, yeah. So there's another idea for you, Dernard. There's another idea for you. So I'm sure you're not paying attention to me. But yeah, that's what Abraham Lincoln did with the suspension of Habeas Corpus Act.